Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Preacher Boys podcast. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
Thank you. So good to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on. I was a little late to the show catching your book. It was on my list, and then it feels like it just came out, and everybody started blowing up Twitter and Facebook and everywhere saying, "Have you read this?" And I was like, "It's sitting here. I know I need to read this. I could do this." And I mean, needless to say, it was well worth checking out, and I really appreciated both from reading your book and then when we did a panel together for Courage 365, which I'll link to in the show notes for people to check out. I was taken aback by you as a person and the way that you approach these stories, because there's a lot of exploitative journalists that I've encountered over the last 3 years. There's a lot of people who I think write these stories without caring about the women or even male victims that are being covered in these stories. So I want to first and foremost say thank you for your approach in capturing these stories.
Thank you. I feel weird saying thank you for treating people with humanity. I will say some of my sources who I've covered for years have had these one-off, quick, and rough encounters with journalists, and that's not the way it should be.
Yeah. It can almost be re-traumatizing when I have conversations where it's a very transactional, like, I want this information so I can get clicks on this article. And I'm curious, just before we even dive into covering these stories, your background's really interesting because you're not coming at this as someone who necessarily experienced the insane branches of Christianity that you cover in your book. You grew up with a little bit of foot in Presbyterian world, in the Methodist world, but you became largely aware of fundamentalist Christianity broadly, the same way most of America did, through TLC, through certain political candidates over the last couple of years. What was the first thing that really caught your attention? Like, what was the first situation or public, event or discourse that really made you focus in on this?
So I will say, though I was raised very middle America, centrist Protestant, I did have a sideswipe with an evangelical church and a mentality that women should not lead. It really upturned my faith along with a super legalistic approach to the Bible. So I did have a crumb of it, but otherwise, yes, I was far outside. But I think because my faith took that turn and then fell apart, I've for years had the sense that faith was something so valuable and something so precious. And I grieved for a long time losing my faith, but I also kept a fascination in how other people believe. I've had that my entire life. So as a reporter, I was following and writing about do-gooders in small business sectors, so not in the religion world, though I had 2 degrees in religion. And one of my crowdfunder companies I had written about told me about a woman who was crowdfunding on their website, and he sent it to me knowing I had some interest in religion. And this woman was from a powerful family, and I was immediately fascinated. I didn't know what quiverful meant. I didn't understand her motivations. I asked what she had read that convinced her now she was leaving. That's why she was crowdfunding. But it was this kind of just drop into a world that had not been my own. But I understood a little piece of it, which was she had been for years motivated by wanting to be good and doing things rightly in the way God wanted, and that I could understand. And it was fascinating to see how someone with those motives can take on so much past the point when their bodies say, I cannot tolerate all these pregnancies, my body shutting down, and try to keep going. And that's, from that story, it just sort of snowballed.
Yeah, certainly did snowball. Yeah. I re-listened to a little bit of your book just last night on the flight home, and one of the phrases I wrote down in my notes was you said the statement like, "Oh, how they wanted to be good," and it just hit me a lot on the second. I think it was one of those phrases that kind of just, I blew past it the first reading, and that time reading it was like, that has been my experience with so many I've interviewed. And I want to say very clearly, whatever someone's motives were, whether it was to be good or whether they bucked against the system, doesn't have any bearing on what happened to them being right or wrong. But it is fascinating to me with how vilified these women are and how they're treated as though they always had an agenda against the church. Like most that I've interviewed have been the most loyal, the most faithful, the most devoted members of the church. And the church did not return the favor. And I think that shows through your book, page after page, and really, I think, is what's going to resonate with people who grew up that way. This raises an interesting question. You're covering, you mentioned the Quiverful movement, but in your book, you cover everything from Independent Fundamental Baptists, which rub shoulders with that, IBLP, which is very much that, Southern Baptist, which, it's so funny when I read about the Southern Baptists now, because they were considered liberal to us in the IFB for a long time. You covered Douglas Wilson's kind of cult unto himself that he's developed. All of them could have been their own book. You could have easily done a couple books on Douglas Wilson, I'm sure. What made you go, I'm not going to niche down to one specific denomination and rather focus on fundamentalism as a whole?
I mean, to me, the entry point was not a specific denomination. I didn't come from any of these worlds. The linking points for me were how I encountered the people speaking up and out through the internet. And so much of this, like the way evangelicalism as a whole, it's not a creed, it's not a doctrine. It's informed in many ways by the ministries people I talk to, the books they read. It's a marketplace of theological ideas. So in some ways, it's a choose your own adventure, but in other ways, people are easily influenced by friends in a local church or by pastors. And these pastors rely upon the credibility they garner from other high figures, either within their own denomination or others. So you have a web of credibility where people get referrals onto the next. So it isn't isolated. It isn't, to my mind, a specific denomination dealing with these things. It's the way that authority is structured across so many of these institutions that then creates cultures where abuse can flourish. And also, it's a certain nervousness, fear when abuse does surface, because I think that sense of authority actually is so tenuous that leads to cover up. Because if this culture that I have bred in my individual ministry has led to abuse, I may not be as credible as your authority figure, as your minister. You can choose to go to anyone else, but keep your loyal customers / congregation. You need to have a veneer of godly authority and godly privilege often. So I think that's, to me, why the book is so amorphous. And I know it would be simpler if I had just taken one bite here. My first draft of this book was much longer. But I kind of wanted people to feel overwhelmed, because the people who noticed the similarities in the way that abuse happened were likewise overwhelmed to see the scope, to see the scale.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's a daunting thing. And I always struggle with this of like, how much history lesson do you give versus how much personal experience do you give?
Yeah.
And a lot of that I think is wrestling with like who the audience is. And I know for myself, when I release content, I'm not thinking that the leadership within the denomination are going to read it and change, because they already are aware of these things in many ways.
Yeah.
I'm typically writing for people who, or recording for people who are either about to leave and are secretly listening, or have left and are trying to figure it out. For you, who was your audience? Were you writing to inform general public? Were you writing with the intent of, I hope people read this and resonate? Was it a little bit of both? Like, who did you have in mind as you wrote each page?
Yeah, so this is something that I believe is possible given the stories I've written. So I've covered these topics doing both. That's what I'm headed doing both. I write about what to secular folks may seem very niche types of experiences in broad secular publications. So I have to help people who are not from these faith communities understand what it would be like and personalize the experience, but then also show why is this relevant to people outside of this church. So I often have seen, and it's unusual to see this in social media, but I will have audience responses from Christians and atheists, feminists, and sort of moderate Christians, sort of okay with egalitarianism, but they'll find a point of convergence in the story and find things to discuss, and without vitriol, without just the nastiness that can happen. And my goal for the book was to try to replicate that, to reach folks still very committed to the church despite all of this, to reach people considering leaving or have left, and also folks who have like a vague understanding of Christian nationalism, and they've heard the word Christian patriarchy. They don't know what it's like, but they sure do care how people are treated. So I'm hopeful that that's the group I'm getting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've seen those conversations too, where you have people find those common points, and it's one of the things. Like for me, abuse is one of the areas I think we can be bipartisan about. And if anything, like the bar is low. Like let's make that the issue that we can link arms on. And I think your book does a good job of being somewhat agnostic in its overall tone. Like it doesn't feel preachy in terms of leave religion or stay spiritual, or all of those things that can become kind of roadblocks for people to actually consume the information. I'm curious too, you mentioned a little bit earlier about power, and do you think, because when you say it's not a specific denomination, it's not a specific religion, you start going, what is the common denominator between all of these organizations? Do you think power is that through line? Do you think it's just individual men who found systems that will serve that desire? Or do you think it's a different, like, here's the fault line running through all these denominations?
Well, I will say that American evangelicalism, and certainly there are some progressive evangelicals, but for the most part in my lifetime, it has been very affiliated with conservative politics in America. So the thirst for power that you may see from people who want expansive megachurch networks, or who want to have a runaway bestseller, fill conference halls, it's so wedded also to political influence. So the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest evangelical denomination, that they would not like that word, it's so deeply married to conservative politics in our country. The ERLC is a lobbying body. Their dollars go to political change.
Yeah.
So I don't think you can extract that. In the same way, credibility between different pastors as they build up their platforms, that relevance, you also get the credibility if you're able to rub shoulders with an up-and-coming Republican governor or a Republican senator. And if you are those people running for office, you garner votes through your attachment to homeschooling families, to these networks of people who want the world to be godly in their image of what that means. So it's very symbiotic.
Yeah. Yeah, that is huge. And I noticed this during COVID quite a bit. And for those listening, don't worry, I'm not going to go deep into COVID here, but because that's a polarizing topic now. But when COVID happened, I saw a prominent independent fundamental Baptist pastor named Paul Chappell in Lancaster. And I know for a fact, firsthand from people who've attended the college, that many of them were given demerits, some I believe expelled for reading John MacArthur's books, because he doesn't toe the line with independent fundamental Baptist theology, because he's Calvinistic and all these sorts of things. During COVID, when California was one of the toughest places for churches to stay open, one day Paul Chappell posts a picture without ever having recanted any of his positions on John MacArthur. He posts a picture with John MacArthur at lunch saying, so thankful for his faithfulness and appreciate him fighting the good fight, essentially. I forget all his exact wording. But I stared at that picture and I thought, this is not for a group that says, oh, it's about the fundamentals and we don't stray from those. It seems like the fundamentals are flexible when it serves a purpose that will keep the doors open. And that was like, to me, such a crystal clear, is like, you can't read John MacArthur's book in your college, but when it comes to fighting the good fight in their mind, all of a sudden we can be buddy. And you see that with politics as well. Obviously, Donald Trump, did not stand for evangelical values in any facet whatsoever, but he spoke to that demographic. There was a clear, direct line to them, and that was intentional. But yeah, I was curious about that, like the through line through all those denominations. One of the things that I wanted to ask about as well, obviously there are good people in these churches. I said it so people listening can go. He said it. There's good people. There's good pastors. I think there's true believers who are misguided in some areas, but there are people with proper right motives. And I think a common critique of anyone who covers the bad is, why focus on the bad and not focus on those good people? You mentioned in your book, you said, I wanted a faith that would bring me closer to heaven, and all the talk in the church seemed to be about hell. And it kind of made me internally question, we cover these stories and critics seem to say the same thing about that. It's like, you focus on the bad. We want to talk about the good things, like the good pastor here, the good, the medical centers opened here, all the critiques and all the things that Christians have done. Why do you think it is so important to focus on this problem? And I'm asking this with an answer of my own in mind. Why do you think it's so important to address this problem rather than focus on highlighting examples of doing it right?
Well, I would say, for one, I feel like I just read a whole book about the good people, for some of these folks, speaking up was their way of trying to save the church. They're not trying to sacrifice the church in their quest for speaking about abuse. They're trying to save it. Now, certainly some people lost their faith along the way, but many still have a desire, or they would have quit long ago, because this is difficult and can be horrible. They want to protect other people within those churches. I think ignoring ugliness does not make it go away. Ignoring pain does not heal it. Now, that said, I had an experience a couple of weeks ago. Krista Brown, who has led the charge for reform in SBC for years, was actually invited to my hometown by an American Baptist pastor here. And he hosted a 3-day series of events. And the first one was an ecumenical event for all sorts of clergy. And we talked about abuse. And we did a community event, and she spoke at his church. And I think there are two things that are important there. One, it was open, it was honest, it was just within a church. And afterward, people came up to Krista and I and confided things I don't know they'd ever felt comfortable saying at all. But they said it in a church. And the other piece is that Pastor Jason Henschel, reading the book, immediately said, what can I do? I don't want my church to feel like that. I want my church to be somewhere where we talk about these things and try to prevent them. So it's not that that's negative. The response was so affirming and so positive because people, you could see it maybe felt a little risky. This isn't something pastors talk about every week. But he did it out of care for his congregation. And frankly, I think out of awe for someone like Krista.
Yeah, it's huge. I want to clap when you say you covered the good people. That's such a good way to talk about it. I mentioned this before we record. This is one of the things that's one of the critiques of the docuseries that I was just involved in, Let Us Pray. One of the critiques from a couple pastors has been, you broad brush the entire denomination and you broad brush all of the independent Baptists. And I just sitting there watching the documentary and seeing my friends on the screen sharing these stories and going, they were independent fundamental Baptists. Like these are people who aligned with your beliefs. The only reason that any of that relationship to the church changed was how it responded to their abuse. And so it was an interesting thing to me. Not only are victims not included as part of the church in many of these cases, like immediately they're kind of exorcised from the church, but also like their very like identity and humanity is stripped away to say like they're, you know, you're broad brushing all of the IFB as bad. It's like, well, no, I'm calling out, there's an innocent person here that's been hurt. And the church has an opportunity in that split second to go, what kind of church are we going to be? And it's encouraging, like the churches you mentioned, like, and you met, I was so jealous when I saw the picture, you know, meeting Jimmy Hinton in person. And, you know, I think of people like that who I've encountered who like defied the mold in a lot of ways and are doing that good work. And the attitude of theirs is not, it's never, let's silence victims because they make us look bad. It's like, let's listen and see what we can do better. And I think that's a really powerful thing to see.
Yeah. And for those naysayers, just, you know, be the good example. If you want more examples out in the world and for people to report on them, be that a good example. Show people that how it could be done well.
Yeah. I told someone that the other day, they said, my church isn't like that, which I get all the time. And I literally said, then this is not about you. And and then a friend of mine who's an advocate, she said, it can be about you if you don't listen. But right now, this isn't about you. Like we're talking about this specific issue, and you can, again, choose which side you want to stand on. I want to dive into the book and the approach, and you specifically interviewed female victims for the book. And it is, you mentioned this at the beginning of your introduction, I believe it is, and it's something that was in my mind reading it, is that women, and I think this is a bit of a cliche, but there's always been that thought of like the mom dragging the kids and the dad to church, the grandmother making sure her family gets that next generation of faith. Women have been the biggest supporters of the church throughout last several generations. That's been the, you know, they're dragging the husband to church who doesn't want to hear it. And all those stories have become commonplace. And heralded as these incredible stories.
And backed up statistically, women have until now been more religious than men.
Right. And the stats in Barna studies forever have been, 60, 70% women, smaller portions men. For, you say in your book, they're kind of the canaries in the coal mine. Like they started leaving quickly. That is pivoted drastically over the last couple of years. Why do you think women have always bared the responsibility of what people do with the church? So women have been responsible to drag people into the church and to drag the people, and with good intentions, I think, to raise better families, to have their husband, experience change within the church, all those stories. So now women are faced with the responsibility of dragging all those same people back out of some of these churches and are being listened to about as much. So why do you think that responsibility has always been on the shoulders of women specifically?
That's such an interesting question. I cannot hope to answer for all of church history. I suspect part of it is that just that a maternal sort of responsibility. I mean, I even went through this a bit as an agnostic and then an atheist with my own children. When they were little, we realized they won't understand cultural references. They had no idea who Noah was. And I didn't want to opt them out of faith. That was wrong in my mind too. But I was also at that point uncomfortable being in a church. So it was really a pickle. But it weighed on me. In grad school, we read these devastating colonial journals from women who lost their children before they had been baptized. And just the sheer devastation of feeling as if not only had they failed in their minds, a failure to be able to keep their child alive, but because they had not gotten them baptized, they would be suffering eternal torment. And so the women tormented themselves for years and years and years. I don't know why that would weigh on mothers more than fathers. But I have seen anecdotal evidence over and over that sometimes it does. I also think in many churches, the communal experiences often revolve around food. And so by default, women are the ones in the kitchen. So I think that gives like a social piece of it. I cannot explain why generation after generation of women in churches where men hold leadership positions would feel so desperately committed to those structures, other than perhaps dedication to being in the pew was the most they could show, and so they chose to do that. However, I think your point that for so long it was women dragging folks into the church, and now they're part of the group dragging them out. That's interesting. I think of it more as a wave of abandonment. So now we're seeing with survey data from Gen Z women, typically if people do leave the church up until now, and generationally it has been men leaving more than women. Men forever have been more likely to be atheists than women. Gen Z, we're seeing more women leaving, so the threshold is flipping. So this is a very recent historic moment in America. And I think just in my own reporting, I believe a big chunk of that has been the church response post Me Too, and then the rabid support of Donald Trump by leaders who maybe even acknowledged accusations against him, the same ones who put so much pressure on women to remain pure, to protect men, making abuse the woman's fault, and to see those same people vociferously support a man who, in their eyes, they saw as an abuser. that just broke a lot of believers. The sheer hypocrisy of it really it hardened a lot of people's faith.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot that I started thinking about as you were sharing all that.
Yeah,
And
that was long. Sorry.
No, I mean, that's really, it's funny because, when you start doing something like this, for you've been covering these things for a long time, and through articles, now through the book. For myself, like, really, I've been looking into this for a long time, but I've been publicly talking about it and interviewing experts for like 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And you always feel like this frustration of, you can understand so much and still feel like you understand so little about what makes these things tick. And like you said, it's hard for me as a, I look at it, I told my wife this like probably 2 years ago, like early on in the show. And I said, I understand why so many men have been comfortable in this system for so long, because there's not really any drawback to being a man. And there are, but I would say, observationally speaking, growing up in it, there's not a lot of drawbacks. If you're a woman, you get a lot of drawbacks, almost exclusively drawbacks. And so I was telling her, I was like, I don't understand how women stay in these environments. But I think the real answer is they believe it. They believe that this is God's word. What's being taught is God's word. But it's on the flip side now, I find myself in a position where, I've said it a billion times, the minute my bubble burst was when I found out there was a story of abuse within our denomination. Because it went from going, nothing bad can happen here, we're perfect, to, oh, we're not. But now I find myself in conversations with men, even men who are loosely allying with survivors. And I feel like I'm missing something in translation when we have conversations where I'll address an issue and I'll say, hey, for example, I was told as a teenage boy, if you struggle with pornography, get married because then you can use your wife. That's the exact verbiage I was told.
Yes.
I told that to somebody recently who is still a Christian, and they said, well, I understand what they're saying. And they started going to, and I sat there and I said, I don't think you do. Let me say it again, because to me, people identify like they're starting to see some of these obvious things, but it's like once you start getting into the system that creates it, people get very panicky about that system being disrupted. It's like, well, I get it. It's not bad for me. I understand this part. And I don't understand, and I'm sorry, this isn't really a question. I just want to share this, is for me, I don't understand why so many men struggle with empathizing with women who are sharing these stories. Because again, I can't resonate with some of the rules and the horrific things that I know friends of mine who grew up in these denominations experience. But for me, it's like hearing the stories enough to change that perspective. And I feel like for a lot of men, they refuse to read the Bible through women's eyes. They refuse to hear stories through women's eyes. Why do you think there is that resistance to hearing that stuff and to really putting yourself in the shoes of women within the church?
Yeah, well, I think the theological education is very gendered. It's very bifurcated within evangelical churches. So though you share the same, even physical church, what you're taught is different. Like you may be taught that your wife can be a sexual method match, and meanwhile, the girls are given lessons about like this balled up paper, this ripped up rose, or this chewed up cookie. That's you if you let a man touch you, and you're ruined for your future husband. Oh yes, but then once you're married, you're not really able to say no, because now it's your responsibility to keep him from having an affair, to keep him from looking at pornography. The responsibility, those factors of responsibility are different. The other piece that I think creates that compassion gap is within the Protestant denominations where abuse has come out, it's far more likely that it's women speaking up. And I think part of that is simply the timing of Me Too and church too. Part of that is a very gendered view on men, on homosexuality, men who have been abused by other men. Mm-hmm. If they come out as having been abused, they're going to be called queer. They're going to be seen as a sinner. Now, women may be seen as having been as non-sinful too, but it's a different set of pressures. I do not believe that we have an accurate scaling for the amount of abuse among men in these churches, just looking at national statistics. But the Catholic Church, though there were female victims, frequently there were men whose cases came to public attention. And for a long time, Protestants generally said, oh, that's the Catholics, that's not us. So I think there's still that piece too, where it's more difficult for men from Protestant churches to speak up. And I really struggle with that because as a reporter, I need to tell stories that, one, I don't want to make people public. I'm very leery of being the first place someone comes forth with an abuse claim. And I have witnessed, this is why I wrote the book, that this wave of advocates has predominantly been women, but not only women. And over time now we're seeing more like gender non-binary folks who are maybe racist girls who are part of this too. So it's more complicated. But also I was trying to play off of this binary that exists.
Yeah.
And show like this is a piece of why it's been such a problem.
Yeah. It is. I think even culturally, the stigma, I'm glad you mentioned it, the stigma around men coming forward as victims is huge. I would say 100 times so in the churches like the ones I grew up in, where, like you said, and I've mentioned before, I think homophobia plays a massive role in why you see so few male victims come forward. And I think that's just an obvious thing. And I always read that 1 in 6 statistic for men, 1 in 4 for women. And I have to go like, those numbers have to be off. And there has to be a lot more women and there has to be a lot more men that would fall into that. You mentioned something, and it's a perfect transition to something that's important to me as someone who's trying to cover these stories. And so this is free coaching for me right now. No, you mentioned for people who are coming to you to share their story, and that is a huge responsibility. And one of the things I like about you is you view it as such. And I think, again, I've encountered a lot of reporters, journalists, podcasters in the last couple of years that I don't think bear any weight of that. They just kind of tell the story. Talk to me about choosing whose stories to share, because I'm sure your inbox is flooded constantly with people who have their own stories. And you mentioned in your book, there's people who may not be in the right place, mentally yet to share the story. And you can tell just by knowing how this is going to affect that it may be too much for them at the time. They may need to pursue legal options first, which I've sent probably literally hundreds of people to lawyers or police, depending on where their case sits right now. And you have to factor in like just the general, are they ready for the amount of exposure this story is going to get?
Yeah.
For you, when someone reaches out, how do you kind of filter through those requests while also not being the arbiter of, are you allowed to tell your story? Because that can feel that way that, hey, my platform's not the place yet. You don't want to be another person giving a cold shoulder to them.
So funny you mentioned my inbox this past weekend. I don't know I get emails from folks and DMs, but I just right now have a number of just big institutional stories that people have come to me with, each of which would require extensive investigation. And I'm kind of like, I'm one person, I'm a freelancer. So I think with anyone who reaches out, and sometimes they just want to talk, which, I mean, I'm not a therapist, but I can listen and I can say, like, here's what other people have gone through when they did come forward. Nothing may happen. This is going to be on the internet forever. Your kid, when they Google your name in third grade, this may be the first thing that comes up. We'll have no control. Have you talk to the police? I mean, one thing I will need is a paper trail, both for your sake, for the credibility of the story and my own credibility. And I have to explain. I ask these questions of everyone. This is an extensive process. You're committing to quite a bit of scrutiny from me because I need to make sure the story is airtight for you later. And in that way, just check their memory too. I mean, people have been through trauma. The interviewing process can be long, and then we'll have to circle back and reconstruct timelines. It's a big thing to go through. Now that said, if someone hears all of that, I may pitch the story and no one may take it, and then we'll have done a lot of pre-reporting for nothing, and are still game. I'm still cautious and say, would you like to use a pseudonym? Or I might encourage them to use a pseudonym, just for all the reasons I've already mentioned. And then I may have to fight with an editor who would prefer a name and explain here's the impact. Usually at this point, editors know in their policies of publications about outing sex abuse survivors.
Right.
But it's a huge decision tree.
Yeah. Do you work with major publications? Like you've worked with like Vice and like legitimate publications beyond you just putting the story out, and so how much of a fight do you find yourselves in with how different publications choose to approach these stories? Because even down to the titles of articles, because you can read, I've said this before on mine, like I try to be careful with the titles of my episodes because I don't want to focus on the most grisly. Thinking about if somebody Googles their mom in 3rd or 4th grade, is the title going to be their name raped? Like all of these kind of incendiary kind of titles that may be necessary in some circumstances, may not in others. Like, do you find yourselves fighting with insensitive publications often about how they package a story you've spent so much time preparing? There's the answer for that.
Yeah. So the title, boy, I mean, just in general in this industry, the writer often has no control over your headline or the deck. I can put in what I think it should be. Usually, a good editor will let me see what they're planning on. And if it's online, like keywords they're planning on using. And at that point, if I have to give an impassioned rationale for why they need to change it, I happily do so. But it's like there's often a battle on some front, but usually it's more of an education. People just don't know because they haven't dealt with this or done exactly this type of story before. But yeah, the pieces that I'm not able to control they make me nervous. The art that goes with the story is a mystery to me until it's published, almost always. So that's what draws people in, and I get like no control over that at all. So yeah, that's also something I have to tell the sources. Like it's and a piece that just if someone's thinking about calling me or emailing me, so even once the story is written, and maybe through the first round of edits, I do an initial fact check with the source on every item I say. It either happened to them or that you said this, you said that. I give them the draft of the story that's against journalistic ethics, but I believe in the case of a survivor, they deserve to know exactly what I'm saying. This I to make sure I understood it correctly, and then depending upon the publication, they then also hear from an additional fact checker. Then we have to go through legal review, where I've annotated the entire story to link out to whatever documents I have. So it's a process. It really is.
Yeah. Well, I have two more questions. One, you mentioned the education piece, which I love that approach, like educating people on what to say, because a lot of times unintentional harm happens through these processes. With that in mind, for anyone who is covering these stories, whether it is a larger publication or whether it's someone who is watching TLC and doing recap videos on YouTube, like that whole spectrum of people that are covering these, if you could encourage people to consider or take into mind one thing when approaching how they cover these stories, what would you say?
One, yes, you're dealing with someone's most vulnerable moment, maybe the worst thing that ever happened to them, and I guess treat them the way you would hope to be treated, and opening yourself up to the world about something so personal.
Yeah, I love that. It's in, I think even just the word someone, like that it's a person, and especially this is what gets muddy in the reality TV world, which happens to cover a lot of these things, is that we look at people as a cast of characters, you know. And I thought that again watching the docuseries just this last weekend, like I'm seeing people I know and seeing them on TV, and I've seen this in podcasts and even in your book. I know many people that you interviewed in your book personally, and you see like how their story is structured in a series or in a book, but then it's also you have all of these layers of, oh, I know what their favorite drink is at Starbucks, or I know this about them, or I know their husband, I know this person, I know that how their parents probably feel about this piece of information. And it is important, I think, to remember like treating everyone as if they have, because they do, they have that humanity behind them and all these layers that you don't see. And I think that's huge. The last question I got to ask you, we've exposed a lot through this book, and the stories, like you said, your inbox is overflowing and abundant with many more to cover. What do you see your focus being next? Is there a disobedient women too? Is there more of a here's how we start fixing this approach? Like, where do you see the focus and direction being moving forward?
So that's a question a few people have been asking me. I sort of gave myself a break over the last couple of months and only did book stuff. I feel obligated, if I can, to research and cover a couple of these larger stories that have landed with me, if I'm able to. But actually, the question you're asking about women and why they stayed for so long and why they're leaving now, that's something that I've wanted to write about for almost a decade. It's like this major lingering question, and now I feel like what I predicted is happening, so I should get to write about it.
Yeah.
So that's something I'm likely to try to cover into the future. But sadly, there's no shortage of abuse stories. And at this point, that's kind of what I know how to do.
Well, I I had to ask because I want to be, and that's why everyone asks, I'm sure. We got to get the scoop on what book 2 is, but truly, I don't want to at all invalidate the amount of work that you've done so far. And this book is going to make ripples, I think, for a very long time. And I see new people reading it every single week. People are tagging me in it, and saying, "Hey, have you read this? Or have you checked this out?" And it's really incredible. And I am a huge fan of you and of your work. And I think taking a break is appropriate. And I know also, because I think you're similar in a lot of ways to me, you're not going to be able to take a break for long. There's lots to dive into, lots of stories to cover. But thank you so much for doing this, taking time out of your schedule. And for anybody who wants to connect with you, obviously they need to buy a copy of Disobedient Women immediately. What's the best place to keep up with you and what you're working on?
Oh boy, so I feel so fragmented. I'm still on Twitter, or what I still call Twitter. I've kind of moved over to Threads. I've been doing Instagram more. I have Substack, so I'm all over the internet.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, wherever people connect with you, I hope that they do. And thank you again for doing this. I really appreciate it. And look forward to chatting again really soon.
Thank you.